think the idea of any sort of global warming or man-made global warming has become so polarized from a political standpoint. And at the end of the day, it's just technology, right? So I think that we need to get away from the fact of just looking at the benefit of global warming because it's very difficult to quantify. We see a lot of people that, want to go to all the solar events. Well, at the end of the day, if you're searching for customers, they're probably not going to be other solar groups, right? Unless that's your client base. So we've focused on a lot of real estate conferences where our customers, which are real estate owners, developers, and real estate engineering firms, things like that, go to. If you're going to do a cold email or you're going to do any sort of reaching out to customers, they need to see that there's a real person behind that email, right? And I think LinkedIn helps with that because they can go to your profile, see who you are, see that you're not just some person in China or India shooting off emails, working out of, one of these big data centers. They can see that there's a real person there.
Hi, Brad. Thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what O3 Energy does?
Yeah. First off, thanks for having me on the podcast, Chris. I'm Brad Stutzman, founder and CEO of O3 Energy. O3 Energy, we are a renewable energy development company. We also offer several renewable energy services to our customers and are adding more services now to not just attack energy needs with our customers, but help to reduce their use of energy as well. So we focus mainly on commercial properties, and then we also offer small utility scale solar development also.
So from what I understand, you made quite a big pivot into commercial from residential a couple of years ago, and it seems like you could tell the future, read the writing on the wall. Obviously now with the ITC cliff. Can you tell me a little bit about what convinced you at the time that felt like the right call, and how did you kind of manage that pivot internally?
Yeah, so we had always offered commercial and small utility scale development services and attacked projects for our investors as well. But we also had a residential side of the company. So at the time, we were probably about 50% residential, 50% commercial small utility. That was about kind of our revenue mix of where the revenue for the company was coming from. We started to see on the residential side that, our revenue was dropping drastically. We were trying to pivot and look at different ways to attack that, to bring that revenue back. We had the residential side of the company for probably about 6 years at that time. And traditionally it had always done pretty well for us, but it just kept seeming like the revenue was dropping. Everything that we were doing was not helping. Interest rates were continuing to go up drastically. Everybody saw that about 2 years ago. Interest rates were just shooting up. And, the more we looked at it, the numbers here in Texas from a residential standpoint were more and more difficult to make the numbers work for our customers. And so, a lot of groups were jumping into third-party ownership structures for residential or, other ways to kind of skin the cat. I've personally never really believed in third-party ownership structures for residential homeowners. I don't think it necessarily is the best value for them. And so we just decided we were going to kind of hang up our hat on the residential side. We were getting to a point wherever the residential side of the company was kind of needing a little bit of help from the commercial side to stay afloat, some capital here or there. And at the end of the day, we just decided, let's just pivot back to 100% commercial and small utility like we had been before, and let's just exit the residential solar side.
It's quite interesting to me because I've heard of a lot of resi companies that tried to break it into commercial and didn't quite manage to kind of work with that whole funding delay that you get with commercial. And so it ended up being that the resi side was supporting the commercial side. Whereas with you guys, it sounds like you were basically the opposite. And so I find it really interesting to know, like when you first started the company, was it a case of you knew commercial was a good opportunity to go to, and that's why you kind of spread between, I guess, all three sectors. Tell me a bit about that.
So yeah, so traditionally the commercial side was what we knew commercial and small utility, and so that was why we focused on that. We knew how to raise the capital for projects in that middle market credit area. And so that was what we focused on. Being here in Texas, the residential solar industry started picking up here in Texas about that time. And so we saw the opportunity. We were receiving a lot of phone calls from groups, from individual homeowners, because you go online and Google us, and we showed we had been in the market for, years. We hadn't necessarily always been attacking Texas. Had also been attacking some, other states throughout the Southwest. But just being a Texas firm and the way that most Texans like to deal with Texan companies. And so that's why we were receiving a lot of calls on the consumer side of things. And, the more calls we received, the more we're like, well, maybe we should start offering residential solar services. So we built out that side of the company to do that. And we were very successful with it for a long time. I would say the biggest hit just came from the increase in interest rates whenever it started squeezing the margins out of the offering for residential customers here in Texas. You haven't seen that as much in some other areas. California, the rates are so high out there that, you can squeeze them a bit more and still make a pencil great. Texas is just a bit tougher. And you're seeing that now with some of the other go-to-market strategies that some groups are putting together, mainly focused on batteries.
You've now launched some pretty innovative offerings. So there's things like the solar split model and the O3 asset care. And so I find that quite interesting because you've almost like pivoted there and innovated there. What signals or problems in the market got your attention for that?
So, we originally got into the commercial side of things, years ago whenever we started the company, because there was a lack of capital. And we were doing pretty good at raising capital from private investors to attack middle market credits. There weren't a whole lot of large groups out there at that time that were attacking the KW to about a megawatt size projects. Everybody wanted the big investment grade clients, which are, a megawatt plus. And then you had groups that were attacking the consumer credit side, which was residential. But at that time, there weren't a whole lot in the middle. And now you see a lot more. So that was why we had come in to offer that solution. And that was where we really saw ourselves. Now, focusing back on our core strengths of the commercial side of things, we've started reevaluating, what's needed in the marketplace now, right? There's a lot of groups out there offering capital for that middle market. So, the things that we saw, one is we've seen a lot of commercial properties that, you talk to the property owners and they're unable to really see the benefit of solar, either because, they don't pay the electric bills, or the portion of the electric bills for the property that they pay is so small compared to the overall consumption of the property. It just doesn't really make sense for them to install solar, or didn't make sense for them to install solar. They just really couldn't recoup the benefit of it. So our solar split model allows the building owner to come in, install solar on their property, and then pass the savings on from solar to their tenants in the form of a lower electricity rate. And then it allows the building owner to recoup their investment through the passing on of those savings. So in essence, the building owner is replacing the utility in the area and subsidizing the electricity. So that's our solar split model. And it allows either multifamily property owners or like retail strip property owners, any sort of property owner that doesn't pay the electricity bill typically in their units to capitalize on solar.
I'm really interested in your decision-making process because you said the interest rates had come down and that's why it made sense to move into resi. And then there was this gap in the market for the middle of market, basically. And so every company goes through pivots. Every company kind of creates new product lines. They decide what to do next. And the company you start is never the company you have 2 years later.
Right.
And so I'm interested to find out from you, like How do you know which decisions are worth building and which ones are distractions? Especially when like the market is telling you they want one thing, but you know you might not necessarily be able to do it.
I mean, there's a for my decision making process, there's a few steps that I always take. One is kind of a brainstorming session. Hey, this is, these are some ideas. And then I typically bounce them off the team, right? Typically, have a meeting within the team, our, head of sales, head of operations, whoever else needs to be involved in that decision-making process. Hey, is this something that our customers, would benefit our customers? Is this something that they could use, that they need? And then let's take a look at, is this something that we can make profitable as well? And then, also, once we start looking at the numbers and seeing that it could be a good product to roll out, that it would benefit our customers, it would be profitable, let's look at it from an operations standpoint and see, how are we going to make this happen and make this move fluidly and put all these pieces together from an operational standpoint. And then how is that going to fit into our current operations now? So it's a step-by-step evaluation process, and it's not anything that I just do on my own. You need other people within the company that are providing that feedback from their area of expertise.
In that pivot back to commercial, when it comes to sales and marketing, was there anything that was particularly challenging about it?
So from a residential standpoint and pivoting back to the commercial side of things and putting 100% of our energy behind the commercial side, some of the things that, and this was probably an error on our part, just getting into the residential side of things. We had to obviously re-educate some customers as far as our brand goes. We still get a lot of individuals, even though we tried to separate it from a branding standpoint of O3 Home Solar and O3 Energy Solutions, it still had the O3 name on it. And so we still get calls all the time from groups asking if we would, offer residential maintenance for them and things like that. So there is that hurdle that we run into from time to time, maybe attracting the client base that we no longer service and, trying to recalibrate things to only attracting the client base that we are now serving.
Let's move on to events. So you've spoken before about finding real traction at attending like smaller events outside the solar industry.
Right.
And there's lots of companies within sustainability, renewable energy that get lots of interest through conferences, events, networking, things like that. What is your approach for finding the right events to go to? And how do you make those relationships count when you're in the room with people?
Yeah. So the one thing that we found from events is, we see a lot of people that, want to go to all the solar events. Well, at the end of the day, if you're searching for customers, they're probably not going to be other solar groups, right? Unless that's your client base. So we focused on a lot of real estate organizations, real estate conferences, where our customers, which are real estate owners, developers, real estate developers, and, real estate engineering firms, things like that go to, and building those relationships with those groups. Typically if a developer is going to develop one property, they're going to develop two, they're going to have a pipeline of projects. Same thing with an engineering group that is working with a customer. They're going to have multiple different real estate properties that you might be able to get involved in. So rather than looking for those one-off groups to work with, we like to focus on spending our energy on the groups that may have a portfolio of projects or a portfolio of properties that we can sit down and we can evaluate multiple properties for them at once. And that also helps us to increase our level of success, right? If you get into one property with a property owner and you start looking at it and guess what, they're in an area where you really can't save them a whole lot of money from, their energy bills. Yeah, you can cut it, but there's not a ton of savings there, maybe, 5%, it may not be as attracted to them. But if you have multiple properties that you're working with this customer on, a portfolio of their properties, then you can kind of pick and choose and look at the different ones that are going to be the most beneficial to them and start off on the right foot from the very start and attack the low-hanging fruit, if that makes sense.
Is there anything else for you that's worked really well on that kind of B2B commercial utility side outside of events?
I mean, obviously social media like LinkedIn has always been good. You can, and then, just cold calling. So cold emails, right? Reaching out to those groups that are going to have a lot of properties to work with. And we're also looking at some other technology now, wherever we can identify certain real estate that it's a heavy power user that, we can through the software take a look at, this building has a heavy need for power. Here's the owner of the building. Here's their contact information. So there's a lot of things that are coming on board with AI right now to really help with that process, that sales process.
So you mentioned the cold email there, because I find that there's so many companies that feel like cold email doesn't work or it hasn't worked for them. So has it worked quite well for you? And do you feel there's any particular reason behind that? Is it just the strategy or the targeting or?
Let me back up a little bit. I guess it's not as much the cold
Sure.
email as much as like messaging through LinkedIn, right? So messaging through an app wherever someone can see that you're a real person. I think that's the biggest thing. If you're going to do a cold email or you're going to do any sort of reaching out to customers, they need to see that there's a real person behind that email, right? I think LinkedIn helps with that because they can go to your profile, see who you are, see that you're, not just some person in China or India shooting off emails, as a working out of, one of these big data centers, they can see that there's a real person there. So I think no matter what you do from a standpoint of outreach, you need to put that humanity into that outreach.
Yeah, and I think that's going to become so much more important with how much AI stuff there is out there
Right.
now as well. People have been talking about the personal brand thing for years, and I think now it is actually becoming important because you're absolutely right. People want to know there's an actual human there to speak to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's also why we've done pretty well with the events that we go to. You can see that there's a real person there that you're talking to. It just feels more human than just, our day-to-day lives. We've gotten so, everybody working from home, text messaging, at the end of the day, people want that humanity involved with everything that they do, whether they know it or not. I think it's instinctual.
Yeah, it's just relationships, isn't
Right.
it? In a way, sales and marketing has always been about relationships.
Yeah.
Whether it's the scale, whether it's one-to-one, it's just people want to do business with people they know, like, and trust. Let's talk a bit about messaging. So you've kind of run the gamut with O3 Energy, B2C and then B2B side of things. Said before that solar shouldn't leave with saving the planet. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What messaging is it that you think actually moves the needle in this market? And in fact, all of sustainability?
Yeah. So I've been saying this for years, and I think that the industry is now just catching up to realizing it. At least a lot of the big players in the industry. So, I think the idea of any sort of global warming or man-made global warming has become so polarized from a political standpoint. It's become, our team versus theirs. And at the end of the day, it's just technology, right? So I think that we need to get away from the fact of just looking at the benefit of global warming because it's very difficult to quantify. It's very difficult to put on paper and show this is how we can affect it. This is how we can fix it. These are the things that we're doing right now. There's just so much. You have to basically create a model for the entire world, which is very difficult to do. But the things that you can quantify and the successes around renewable energy, especially with solar, are things like distributed energy, the effects on, how it increases or helps our grid, right? Helps to stabilize our grid. You can also take a look at, bringing down emissions, not necessarily CO2 emissions, but, you look at coal fire plants and the amount of air quality that you have for around these coal fire plants, and you can quantify the health issues that you have. You can quantify all of that very easily. And there's a lot of reports around that. So, I think that whenever you start providing real data that can be quantified and easily shown, that moves the needle a whole lot more than things that are very difficult to quantify and things that can be so political as it is.
Yeah, I liken it to the whole ozone layer thing
Right.
back in the 90s. It was a simple solution to a simple problem. Like there was one discrete problem, one discrete solution. Just use less refrigerants,
Yeah.
right? And I think you're absolutely right. In order to solve global warming, you need to create a model of the Earth and then figure out all the solutions to it. And I think it's easier for people to just kind of switch off or become fearful or become whatever it might be. And I guess that's why it's been so easily politicized.
Yeah.
Because even within sustainability, even within renewable energy, we don't even know everything ourselves.
Right.
And so how can we expect the everyday person on the street to know it? It's not possible. But yeah, bringing everything back to kind of business outcomes or risk mitigation, whatever it might be, resonates with people so much more.
Right. No,
For sure.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and look at the hole in the ozone layer, like you talked about. Now it's shrunk, right? We did successfully reduce our emissions and we did attack that. But you're right. That was the goal. Like, how do we get this? If we can do this, then we can do this and we can quantify it. And I think that is the way to attack a problem, right? Just take it one piece at a time, and each one of these pieces adds up to the overall goal. And, something like global warming is just so difficult to quantify, and it's just overwhelming to people.
With something like renewable energy, talking to businesses, small utility scale, things like that, they obviously at this point understand solar and they
Right.
understand saving energy, stuff like that. But there's so much more that goes into it, into saving energy, energy costs, things like that. How is it you go about educating the markets so they understand it a bit more than just we put solar panels on the roof?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring this up because the education process has definitely changed over the years, right? So 10 years ago, whenever we're first starting off, the education process was so many questions of, is solar, is that even a viable energy source? And you had to explain like, yes, this technology's been around for a little while. People just didn't even.
Does it work when there's clouds in the sky?
Yeah, exactly. People just, does it, almost thinking it's like spotty, like it turns on and off all the time. And, so it was educational processes like, like that, just teaching about the technology itself, because there wasn't a whole lot of solar out there. There wasn't the neighborhood that has, half of their houses with solar on it and they can just go talk to their neighbor or, something like that. So, that was the education process then. Now what we're seeing, the education process is re-educating customers. So now there's a lot of bad information out there, and it's sitting down with them, showing them, okay, well, this is incorrect. That is, a myth that's not necessarily true, and re-educating them as to what the, true benefits, the pros and the cons to the technology are.
That's interesting. Do you feel that's been caused by kind of people talking between themselves, or do you feel like that's been more the media or more like other solar companies?
I
Do you
think it's
have
a
an
mix of
idea?
it all. I think that there's some bad solar companies out there that, just like every industry, there's a few bad actors that kind of ruin it for some people. You've got some, people in the media that likes to push certain agenda. You've got some people in government that like to push a certain agenda. And, sometimes this bad information can really benefits that agenda or that message. And so it's just re-educating people from, hey, if it was that way, would people really be doing that? Would we really have, 90% of all new generation being added onto the grid being solar, right? Would we really have this much renewables going onto the grid? So it's just attacking those and being patient too. I would say that that's another big key, is being patient and providing that literature and that information to show that where you're coming from and what you're explaining to the customer is the truth.
Brad, this has been really interesting. My final question for you is, if you had one piece of advice for another founder in renewable energy sustainability, what would it be?
Yeah, so I would say one piece of advice for anyone is just never give up, continue on pushing ahead. Things are always you're always going to get hurdles, you'll overcome them, and then just push forward.
Thank you so much. How can people learn more about O3, possibly work with you?
Yeah, so they can go to our website, o3energy.com. That's the letter O, the number 3, energy.com. Same thing on all the social medias, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. It's O3 Energy.
Got it. Brad, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate this.
All right, thanks for having me on, Chris.